The screen glowed in the darkened office, 2 in the morning, Mountain View, California, December 2009. The Google security engineer had been tracking something for hours, and the pattern was wrong. Network traffic that shouldn't exist, code repositories being accessed by dormant accounts, authentication tokens appearing from IP addresses that made no sense. He traced the activity backward through encrypted layers, through proxy servers, through commercial hosting services in Taiwan. The trail kept going, Texas, California, then back across the Pacific to Shanghai. Someone was inside Google's network right now, this moment, downloading source code, not just reading files, systematically extracting the algorithms that powered the world's most dominant search engine. The engineer's hands moved faster across the keyboard. He expanded the search. Adobe was compromised. Juniper Networks showed the same signatures. He pulled up the classified list of affected companies his team had been quietly building. 34 major corporations, defense contractors, financial firms, technology giants, all breached, all bleeding data to the same infrastructure. This wasn't random hacking. This wasn't cybercrime. The coordination was perfect. The timing was synchronized. The targets were strategic. This was a military-grade cyber operation conducted by a nation-state, and it had been running undetected inside America's most secure corporate networks for months. The engineer picked up his phone and called his supervisor. That call would trigger the first public accusation that China had conducted state-sponsored cyber warfare against American corporations. The conversation would change internet security forever, because what they'd just discovered wasn't an attack, it was an invasion, and they'd only just realized they were already occupied. Before we dive into exactly how Chinese intelligence pulled off the most sophisticated corporate cyber espionage operation the world had seen and why nobody detected it until it was too late, let me tell you what this channel does. Every single day, I bring you real cyber operations and intelligence campaigns that shaped how we live online today. This isn't theoretical hacking. This is what actually happens when nation-states target corporations, when military cyber units conduct espionage operations, and when the techniques they pioneer become the standard for every attacker that follows. Operation Aurora was the watershed moment when corporate America realized they were legitimate military targets and that their security wasn't nearly as good as they thought. If you're fascinated by how modern cyber warfare actually works and how these operations keep evolving, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear will fundamentally change how you think about internet security and whether anything online is actually safe from determined nation-state attackers. And real quick, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below with your city and country. Are you in Silicon Valley, Beijing, London, Tel Aviv? It's fascinating to see how far these cyber warfare stories reach globally. Let me know where you are. Now, back to mid-2009, when this operation began and nobody knew it was happening. Something was wrong, but nobody could quite identify what. Security engineers at multiple major corporations were seeing anomalies in their networks. Traffic patterns that didn't make sense. Authentication logs that showed activity during off hours. Code repositories being accessed by accounts that should have been idle. The anomalies were subtle, not the kind of obvious intrusion that triggers immediate alarms, more like background noise that suggested something might be happening, but could just as easily be routine system behavior or false positives. Security operations centers at these companies were overwhelmed with alerts. Thousands of potential threats flagged every day. Most of them turned out to be nothing. Legitimate employee activity that looked suspicious. Automated systems generating unusual patterns. Network configurations creating artifacts that resembled attacks. The signal-to-noise ratio was terrible. Real threats got buried under mountains of false alarms. So when engineers started flagging these subtle anomalies, the automated systems classified them as low priority. Just more noise. Nothing to investigate immediately. The anomalies got logged, documented, and filed away, and the attacks continued undetected. The attackers had spent months planning this operation. They weren't opportunistic hackers looking for easy targets. They were intelligence operatives conducting a coordinated campaign with specific strategic objectives. The operation was almost certainly directed by Chinese military intelligence, specifically the People's Liberation Army's Third Department, which handles technical reconnaissance and signals intelligence, working in coordination with the Ministry of State Security for the political targeting components. The tasking was sophisticated and revealed multiple layers of objectives. First layer, economic espionage, steal source code from America's dominant technology companies, Google's search algorithms, Adobe's software architecture, security tools from companies like Juniper Networks and Symantec. This wasn't random theft. The specific targets suggested someone had done strategic analysis of which companies possessed the most valuable intellectual property for advancing China's domestic technology industry. Second layer, supply chain reconnaissance. Defense contractors were targeted to understand vulnerabilities in U.S. military procurement systems. Financial firms were breached to gather economic intelligence. The goal wasn't just to steal what existed today, but to map the networks for future exploitation. Third layer, political surveillance. The attackers wanted access to Gmail accounts of Chinese human rights activists. Dissidents using Google's email service to organize, communicate, and coordinate with international supporters. Chinese intelligence wanted to identify these networks, understand their connections, and potentially disrupt their activities. The attack began with reconnaissance that had probably been running for over a year. The attackers needed to understand their targets before they could breach them. They studied the company's public-facing infrastructure. They identified employees through LinkedIn profiles, corporate directories, and conference attendance. They mapped organizational structures to determine who had access to valuable systems. They analyzed the company's security architecture by examining job postings for security engineers. What tools were they using? What skills were they hiring for? What vulnerabilities might exist in their defensive posture? This patient intelligence gathering is characteristic of nation-state operations. Criminal hackers want quick access and fast profits. State actors are willing to spend months or years preparing for operations because their objectives are strategic rather than financial. By mid-2009, the attackers were ready to move from reconnaissance to active intrusion. They had a weapon that made the operation possible, a zero-day exploit in Microsoft Internet Explorer. A zero-day means a vulnerability that the software manufacturer doesn't know exists. No patch available, no defensive signature to detect exploitation. These vulnerabilities are extraordinarily valuable. On black markets, a good zero-day exploit for widely used software can sell for hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. The exploit the Aurora attackers used was designated CVE 2000-10024 or 9 after it was discovered and patched. It allowed remote code execution, meaning an attacker could run malicious software on a target's computer just by getting them to visit a compromised website. That's a dream weapon for cyber operations. The attackers deployed multiple techniques to get employees to trigger the exploit. Spear phishing emails were crafted with remarkable sophistication. These weren't the obvious scam emails that most people recognize immediately. They were tailored to specific individuals based on the reconnaissance. An engineer might receive an email that appeared to come from a colleague, referencing a real project they were working on, with a link to what looked like a legitimate document repository. A researcher might get an email that seemed to be from an industry conference they'd attended, with a link to presentation slides. The social engineering was good enough that security-conscious employees clicked the links. The emails directed targets to compromised websites that had been prepared specifically for this operation. Some of these were watering hole attacks. The attackers identified websites that employees of target companies regularly visited, then compromised those sites to inject the exploit code. When a Google engineer visited a technology news site they read every morning, they'd unknowingly trigger the Internet Explorer vulnerability. Their browser would execute the malicious code without any visible indication that something had happened. No warning, no alert, no pop-up asking for permission. The infection was silent and invisible. Once the malware executed on a target's computer, it established what's called persistence, the ability to survive reboots and maintain access even if the initial infection vector gets patched. The malware used sophisticated techniques to blend into the normal operation of the computer. It mimicked legitimate system processes. It ran at times when the computer was active, so its processor usage didn't stand out. It communicated with its command and control servers using encrypted HTTP traffic that looked like routine web browsing. Security systems that monitored network traffic saw what appeared to be an employee accessing normal websites. The malware was modular, meaning it had different components that could be deployed based on what the attackers found on each compromised system. Some modules handled credential harvesting, stealing usernames and passwords that would allow access to other systems. Other modules specialized in privilege escalation, exploiting additional vulnerabilities to gain administrator-level access that provided unrestricted control over the computer and potentially the broader network. Still, other modules focused on lateral movement. Once inside one computer, the malware would map the internal network, identify valuable targets like code repositories or email servers, and methodically work its way deeper into the organization's infrastructure. The attackers had done their homework on Google's internal architecture. They knew about Perforce, the source code management system Google used internally. They knew about the company's internal network topology. And critically, they knew about Gaia, Google's single sign-on authentication system that controlled access across multiple services. Compromising Gaia was like getting a master key. It didn't just give access to one system, it potentially provided visibility into how authentication worked across Google's entire infrastructure. The attackers moved carefully once they had initial access. They didn't immediately grab everything and run. That kind of smash and grab operation tends to trigger alerts. Instead, they conducted what intelligence agencies call low and slow exfiltration. They identified valuable data, they cached it locally on compromised systems. Then they waited for low traffic periods, late at night, weekends, holidays, to transmit the stolen data back to their command infrastructure. The exfiltration was encrypted and broken into small chunks that wouldn't trigger data loss prevention systems watching for large file transfers. The infrastructure the attackers used for this operation was designed for obfuscation and deniability. They didn't route traffic directly to servers in China. That would have been too obvious and too easy to block once discovered. Instead, they created a chain of proxy servers and hop points across multiple countries. Compromised servers in Taiwan received the initial exfiltration. Those servers forwarded the data to commercial hosting services in Texas and California. Servers rented through anonymous intermediaries using stolen payment information or cryptocurrency. The data would hop again from the United States to servers in other parts of Asia before eventually making its way to wherever the attackers were actually operating from. This infrastructure served multiple purposes. It made attribution difficult because the forensic trail led through multiple countries and jurisdictions. It provided redundancy so that if one server got shut down, the operation could continue through alternate paths. And it created plausible deniability. When the operation was eventually exposed, Chinese government could point to all the non-Chinese infrastructure and claim that the attackers might have been anyone. By late 2009, the operation was running at full scale across dozens of organizations simultaneously. The attackers had successfully compromised networks at Google, Adobe, Juniper Networks, Rackspace, Yahoo, Symantec, Northrop Grumman, Morgan Stanley, and at least 25 other major corporations. The exact number is still disputed. Public reports mentioned 34 companies, but later forensic investigations suggested over 100 organizations were at least probed, if not fully compromised. The attackers were systematically extracting source code from technology companies. They downloaded portions of Google's search algorithms. They grabbed Adobe's software development kits. They took security tools from firms that sold intrusion detection systems, valuable intelligence for understanding how to evade those exact defenses. From defense contractors, they exfiltrated technical specifications, procurement documents, and communications that revealed supply chain relationships. From financial firms, they gathered economic intelligence and strategic planning documents. And throughout this entire period, they were accessing Gmail accounts of specific individuals. The political targeting was particularly insidious. Chinese intelligence had compiled lists of human rights activists, democracy advocates, and critics of the Chinese government who used Gmail for their communications. When Aurora compromised Google's infrastructure, the attackers gained the ability to access these accounts directly. They could read emails, they could identify contacts and map social networks. They could see who activists were communicating with internationally. This information would later be used to identify, monitor, and potentially suppress dissident activities. Some of the Gmail accounts were accessed through direct compromise of Google's systems. Others were accessed through supply chain attacks that had nothing to do with Google's security. The attackers compromised internet cafes in China where activists would access their accounts. They breached small internet service providers that served areas where dissidents lived. They infected routers and networking equipment. These attacks gave them visibility into Gmail sessions even without breaching Google itself. The multi-layered approach showed sophisticated operational planning and revealed that Aurora wasn't just about penetrating corporate networks. It was about achieving intelligence objectives through any available means. For months, this entire operation ran without anyone realizing what was happening. Security engineers saw fragments of the activity, but those fragments didn't coalesce into a coherent picture of a coordinated attack. An engineer at Google noticed unusual authentication patterns, but the automated systems flagged it as low priority. An analyst at Adobe saw code repository access that seemed odd but couldn't definitively prove it was malicious. A security researcher at Juniper Networks investigated anomalous network traffic but traced it to what appeared to be a legitimate employee working from home. The attackers had achieved what every intelligence operation strives for. They were operating below the threshold of detection, collecting valuable intelligence, while their targets remained unaware. The breakthrough came almost by accident. A Google security engineer was investigating a completely unrelated issue with Gmail infrastructure. Something about how authentication tokens were being handled seemed incorrect. While digging through logs to understand that problem, he noticed patterns that didn't make sense. Accounts that should have been dormant were showing activity. Access was occurring from IP addresses that didn't match expected geographic patterns. The timestamps suggested someone was methodically working through systems rather than random user behavior. The engineer expanded his investigation. He started correlating the suspicious activity across multiple systems. The pattern became clearer and more disturbing. This wasn't isolated anomalies. It was systematic access to Google's most sensitive resources. The engineer pulled historical logs going back months. The activity had been happening the entire time, persistent, methodical, focused on source code repositories, internal architecture documentation, and specific Gmail accounts. He brought his findings to his supervisor. They escalated to the security leadership team. Google's security operations went into crisis mode. They began a comprehensive forensic investigation while trying to maintain operational security so the attackers wouldn't realize they'd been discovered. The forensics team worked backward through every compromise they could identify. They analyzed the malware samples they recovered. They mapped the command and control infrastructure. They identified the zero-day exploit in Internet Explorer that had enabled the initial infections. And they started comparing notes with other companies because the targeting appeared to be broader than just Google. When they reached out to contacts at Adobe, Juniper, and other firms through informal security community channels, they discovered those companies were seeing similar compromises, the same malware signatures, the same infrastructure, the same timeline. This wasn't multiple separate attacks. It was one coordinated operation targeting the entire sector. By December 2009, Google had confirmed the worst-case scenario. Their source code had been accessed. Their internal architecture had been mapped. Gmail accounts of Chinese human rights activists had been compromised. The attackers had been inside their network for months, potentially since September or earlier. The question became what to do about it. Google had several options, none of them good. They could quietly shut down the intrusion, patch their systems, and never mention it publicly. That was the standard corporate response to breaches. Minimize public exposure, avoid alerting competitors or shareholders, handle it internally. The problem was that this breach had geopolitical implications. If Chinese intelligence was conducting coordinated attacks against major American corporations, that was a national security issue, not just a corporate security problem. Google could report it to law enforcement and government agencies, but keep it out of public view. That would alert the appropriate authorities while maintaining secrecy. But it would also mean the public would never know that China was conducting cyber warfare against American companies. Other organizations that might be targeted wouldn't get warning. The broader internet security community wouldn't learn from what had happened, or Google could go public, openly state that they'd been attacked, attribute the attack to China, and deal with whatever consequences followed. No major corporation had ever done that before. The business risks were substantial. Shareholders might panic, customers might lose trust, competitors might use it against them, China might retaliate economically. But it would force the conversation about nation-state cyber operations into the open and potentially drive meaningful security improvements across the industry. Google chose the unprecedented option. On January 12, 2010, they published a blog post titled "A New Approach to China" that changed the cyber landscape forever. The post acknowledged that Google and at least 20 other companies had been targeted in a highly sophisticated attack originating from China. It stated that the attackers had accessed intellectual property and tried to access Gmail accounts of Chinese human rights activists, and it announced that Google was reconsidering their operations in China, including whether they would continue censoring search results as Chinese law required. The post was carefully worded. It didn't directly accuse the Chinese government of conducting the attack, but the implication was clear to anyone reading it. This was state-sponsored cyber espionage. The response was immediate and massive. Other companies started coming forward to confirm they'd also been compromised. Adobe acknowledged their breach. Juniper Networks confirmed they'd been attacked. Eventually, 34 companies publicly admitted they'd been targeted, and security researchers estimated the real number was over 100. The media coverage was intense. For the first time, the general public was hearing about nation-state cyber operations targeting private corporations. The story had everything: international espionage, Silicon Valley giants, human rights implications, and technical sophistication that sounded like science fiction. Congress demanded hearings. The State Department got involved. The FBI opened investigations. And Microsoft's security team went into overdrive to develop a patch for the Internet Explorer vulnerability that had enabled the attacks. The forensic investigation that followed Aurora's exposure revealed the full scope and sophistication of the operation. Security researchers analyzed the malware samples and discovered they were far more advanced than initially realized. The code was professional grade, suggesting it had been developed by experienced programmers with significant resources. The malware had modular architecture that allowed attackers to customize their approach for each target. Some modules were designed for long-term persistence and low-profile surveillance. Others were built for rapid exfiltration of specific data types, and disturbingly, some modules appeared to be designed for sabotage rather than espionage. These modules were never activated during Aurora, but their presence suggested the attackers had maintained the capability to destroy data or disable systems if they chose to. That discovery added another dimension to understanding Aurora. It wasn't just an espionage operation. It was also reconnaissance for potential future cyber attacks that could be destructive rather than purely intelligence-focused. The attackers had positioned themselves to cause damage if that ever became a strategic objective. The infrastructure analysis revealed sophisticated operational security. The servers used as hot points had been rented through multiple layers of anonymous intermediaries. Payment was made using stolen credit cards or hard-to-trace cryptocurrency. The physical locations were spread across multiple continents. Taking down the infrastructure required coordination between law enforcement agencies in Taiwan, the United States, and other countries. Even after servers were seized, the forensic evidence was limited because the attackers had used encryption and data wiping tools that left minimal recoverable traces. Attribution was challenging, but ultimately compelling. The malware code contained artifacts that matched tools previously used by Chinese APT groups. The command and control infrastructure had connections to IP addresses previously associated with Chinese military networks. Some of the traffic analysis revealed operational security mistakes where connections briefly touched Chinese infrastructure before being routed through proxies. Most convincingly, the targeting aligned perfectly with Chinese intelligence priorities: economic espionage for technology sectors where China wanted to catch up to Western capabilities, and political surveillance of dissidents that Chinese internal security services wanted to monitor. The U.S. government response evolved slowly, but eventually became significant. Initially, official statements were muted, acknowledgement that an incident had occurred, generic warnings about cyber threats, no direct accusations against China. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels were active. State Department officials raised the Aurora attacks in meetings with Chinese counterparts. The Chinese government's response was predictable denial. They claimed to be victims of hacking themselves and suggested that accusations were unfounded and politically motivated. But the Aurora exposure accelerated conversations that had been happening quietly in defense and intelligence circles about the need for a more robust U.S. cyber capability. The military had been developing cyber operations for years, but Aurora demonstrated that the threat wasn't just military to military. Nation-states were targeting private sector companies, critical infrastructure, and civilian institutions. That required a different kind of response. In May 2010, U.S. Cyber Command was declared fully operational. While U.S. Cybercom had been in development before Aurora, the exposure of the operation provided political impetus to accelerate its activation and expand its mandate. One security engineer's experience captures the organizational and human failures that allowed Aurora to succeed for so long. Internal documents refer to him as Davis, likely not his real name, but the identifier used in classified briefings about the incident. Davis worked in Google's Security Operations Center starting in 2008. He was experienced, competent, and had good instincts for identifying anomalous behavior. In September 2009, 3 months before Aurora was officially discovered, Davis started noticing unusual patterns. Authentication logs showing activity during odd hours, code repository access from accounts that typically didn't touch those systems, network connections to IP addresses that didn't match expected patterns. He followed procedure. He'd filed reports documenting the anomalies. He flagged them for investigation. The problem was that Google's Security Operations Center was being hit with thousands of alerts every single day. The automated threat detection systems were extremely sensitive because missing a real threat was considered worse than generating false positives. The result was alert fatigue. Security analysts became conditioned to assume that most alerts were false positives because historically that had been true. Davis's reports went into the queue along with thousands of other potential incidents. The automated triage systems classified his reports as low priority. The indicators he'd identified didn't match signatures of known threats. They didn't exceed thresholds that would trigger urgent investigation. They looked like they could be explained by legitimate user behavior or system misconfigurations. So the reports got documented, logged, and filed. Nobody told Davis he was wrong. Nobody dismissed his concerns. The system simply didn't prioritize them highly enough to warrant immediate investigation. Davis kept tracking the patterns. He filed additional reports over the following weeks. The activity continued. From his perspective, something was clearly wrong. From the organization's perspective, He was one analyst filing reports about ambiguous indicators, while the security team was dealing with hundreds of other issues that seemed more pressing. It's the kind of organizational failure that happens repeatedly in security. The person closest to the data identifies something important, but the institutional systems fail to elevate that information to decision makers who could act on it. In December, when Google finally confirmed the breach and started forensic investigation, Davis pulled his archived reports. Every anomaly he'd flagged had been Aurora activity. Every unusual pattern had been real. He'd identified the attack 3 months before anyone else. If his reports had been investigated immediately, Google could have stopped Aurora in September. The attackers would have lost 3 months of access. Less source code would have been stolen. Fewer Gmail accounts would have been compromised. The human rights activists whose accounts were accessed might have been warned before Chinese intelligence gathered information that could endanger them. Davis did everything correctly from an individual perspective. He identified suspicious activity. He documented it. He followed reporting procedures. He continued monitoring and updating his assessments. The failure was organizational and systemic. The alert systems generated too much noise. The triage processes weren't sophisticated enough to distinguish his legitimate concerns from the flood of false positives. The staffing levels didn't allow for deep investigation of every ambiguous indicator. These weren't unique problems to Google. They're fundamental challenges in cybersecurity that every organization faces. Aurora succeeded partly because of technical sophistication, but partly because it exploited the organizational dynamics of how security teams operate under resource constraints and information overload. When Congress held hearings about Aurora, Davis testified about what had gone wrong. He explained how security alert fatigue creates an environment where real attacks get dismissed as noise. He detailed how sophisticated adversaries specifically design their operations to look routine enough that they fall below detection thresholds. He talked about the psychological toll of knowing he'd identified the threat, but the system hadn't responded. His testimony was classified at the time, but elements have since been declassified and cited in cybersecurity literature. Davis's experience became a case study used in security training about the importance of analyst intuition, the danger of over-reliance on automated systems, and the need for processes that allow experienced personnel to escalate concerns even when automated tools say everything is normal. Davis left Google about a year after Aurora was exposed. The reasons were never made public, but people who knew him said he struggled with the knowledge that he'd identified the attack, and the organization hadn't acted on his warnings. The guilt wasn't rational. He'd performed his job correctly, and the failure was systemic, not individual. But guilt doesn't respond to rational arguments. He moved to a senior position at a cybersecurity company designing next-generation threat detection systems. He became a frequent speaker at security conferences, though he rarely talked about Aurora specifically. His focus was always on the organizational and process failures that allow attacks to succeed even when individual analysts identify threats. He pushed for security architectures that empowered analysts to escalate concerns without bureaucratic barriers. He advocated for reducing false positive rates, even if that meant more sophisticated and expensive detection systems. And he warned that the dynamic that allowed Aurora to succeed hadn't fundamentally changed. Attackers were getting better at blending in, while defenders were still drowning in alerts and struggling to identify real threats among the noise. I have to pause here and ask you something. Imagine you're Davis. You've identified indicators of a sophisticated attack. You've filed reports following proper procedures. Those reports get logged and classified as low priority while the actual attack continues. You watch the anomalies persist week after week, knowing something is wrong but unable to convince the organization to investigate. What do you actually do? Do you keep filing reports that are getting ignored and trust that the process will eventually work? Do you go over your supervisor's head, bypass the normal chain of command, and risk being seen as insubordinate or alarmist? Do you become more aggressive in pushing your concerns even though you don't have definitive proof and might be wrong? Or do you accept that the system has classified it as low priority and assume that maybe you're seeing patterns that aren't actually there? Drop your answer in the comments below. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. Security analysts face this exact situation constantly. They see something that feels wrong, but they can't prove it definitively. And the organizational systems don't support immediate investigation. The choice they make can determine whether attacks get stopped or succeed. Here's what Davis actually did. He kept filing reports and documenting the activity, but he also started building a more comprehensive case. He spent his own time outside of regular working hours, tracking the patterns across a broader set of systems than his normal mandate covered. He quietly consulted with colleagues in other parts of the security organization to see if they were seeing similar indicators. He built what amounted to a parallel investigation, using resources and time that weren't officially allocated to it. This approach had risks. If he was wrong, he'd wasted significant time and potentially created tension by working outside his assigned scope. But he trusted his instincts and believed the threat was real, even though he couldn't yet prove it definitively. When Aurora was officially discovered in December and the forensic investigation began, Davis handed over everything he'd compiled. His parallel investigation had documented the attack progression in ways that official systems hadn't captured. His analysis became crucial to understanding the full timeline and scope. His persistence was vindicated, but the validation came after the damage was done. The activists whose Gmail accounts were compromised had already been identified. The source code had already been exfiltrated. The 3 months of additional access the attackers gained between when Davis first identified the threat and when the organization confirmed the breach couldn't be recovered. The aftermath of Aurora forced every major technology company to reassess their security posture. The operation had exposed uncomfortable truths about the limitations of even elite corporate security programs: Google, Adobe, Juniper. These weren't unsophisticated organizations with weak defenses. They employed world-class security engineers. They had significant security budgets. They used advanced defensive tools. And they were still comprehensively breached by determined nation-state attackers. That realization drove a fundamental shift in security philosophy. The old model was perimeter defense. Build strong walls around your network and assume that anything inside the perimeter is trusted. Aurora demonstrated that model was broken. Attackers could get inside the perimeter through social engineering, zero-day exploits, and supply chain compromises. Once inside, they could move laterally and access whatever they wanted because internal systems trusted connections that originated from inside the network. The new model that emerged was called Zero Trust Architecture. The fundamental principle is that no user, device, or network connection should be automatically trusted just because it's inside the perimeter. Every access request needs to be verified. Every connection needs to be authenticated. Privilege should be minimized so that compromising one account doesn't provide access to everything. The implementation of Zero Trust was gradual and is still ongoing 15 years after Aurora. It requires fundamental redesigns of how networks are architected, how applications authenticate users, and how data is protected. But the shift began directly because of Aurora's demonstration that perimeter defense was insufficient against sophisticated adversaries. Mandatory threat reporting also became industry standard after Aurora. Before 2010, most companies handled breaches quietly and disclosed them only if legally required or if the breach became public through other means. After Google's decision to go public with Aurora, the expectations changed. The cybersecurity community recognized that information sharing about attacks was essential to collective defense. If one company got breached using a particular technique, other companies needed to know about it so they could defend against the same method. That led to the creation of information sharing and analysis centers where companies could share threat intelligence without publicly admitting to breaches. It led to government initiatives to encourage breach reporting. And it created cultural change where acknowledging you'd been attacked became less stigmatized and more accepted as an inevitable reality of operating in an environment where nation-states conduct cyber operations. The geopolitical implications of Aurora extended far beyond the immediate incident. The operation marked a turning point in U.S.-China relations in the cyber domain. Before Aurora, there was awareness that China conducted cyber espionage, but it was discussed quietly in classified settings. Aurora made it a public issue that couldn't be ignored. The Obama administration used Aurora as justification for raising cyber operations in diplomatic conversations with China at the highest levels. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton gave a major speech about internet freedom in January 2010 that directly referenced Aurora without naming it. The speech called for governments to respect the free flow of information online and criticized nations that used cyber capabilities to suppress dissent. China's response was defiant denial, followed by counter-accusations that the United States conducted its own cyber espionage. The diplomatic tension around Aurora contributed to a cycle of escalation, where both nations expanded their offensive cyber capabilities while accusing each other of aggression. The strategic competition in the cyber domain that defined U.S.-China relations for the following decade can be traced directly back to Aurora's exposure. Chinese cyber operations didn't stop after Aurora was exposed. They evolved and became more sophisticated. The techniques pioneered in Aurora became the foundation for an entire ecosystem of Chinese APT groups conducting operations globally. APT-1, also known as PLA Unit 61398, ran industrial-scale intellectual property theft campaigns from 2010 to 2013. They targeted over 140 companies across multiple industries, stealing terabytes of data. Unlike Aurora's surgical precision, APT-1 operated with almost industrial efficiency. They weren't subtle, they were comprehensive. Their goal wasn't to avoid detection, but to steal so much so fast that defenders couldn't keep up. APT-1 was finally exposed by a security company called Mondiant in 2013, which published a detailed report attributing the group to a specific PLA unit operating from a building in Shanghai. The exposure led to diplomatic protests and eventually indictments of Chinese military officers by the U.S. Justice Department, a largely symbolic action since the officers would never be extradited, but a marker of how seriously the U.S. government was treating Chinese cyber espionage. Cloudhopper, designated APT-10, represented the next evolution. Running from 2014 to 2017, Cloudhopper didn't target companies directly. Instead, they compromised managed service providers, the companies that run cloud infrastructure and IT services for hundreds or thousands of other organizations. By breaching an MSP, APT-10 could access data from all of that MSP's clients simultaneously. It was supply chain compromise at global scale. The operation demonstrated that Chinese cyber units had learned from Aurora's exposure and adapted their tactics. If direct attacks against major corporations were now too likely to be detected and create diplomatic problems, the solution was to attack the service providers that those corporations trusted. Cloudhopper compromised organizations in at least a dozen countries before being exposed in 2017. APT-41 showed yet another evolution, combining state-sponsored espionage with criminal activity for financial gain. Running from approximately 2015 to 2020, APT-41 would conduct traditional intelligence collection operations, targeting specific companies or sectors, but also engage in financially motivated hacking like video game currency theft and ransomware deployment. The hybrid model made attribution more complex because criminal activity could be plausibly denied as the work of independent hackers rather than state-sponsored units. Each of these operations built on Aurora's foundation. The social engineering techniques became more sophisticated. The zero-day exploits became more reliable. The infrastructure became more elaborate, with additional layers of obfuscation. But the fundamental playbook remained the same. Identify strategic targets, compromise them through technical and social engineering, establish persistent access, map the internal networks, exfiltrate valuable data, and maintain operational security to delay detection for as long as possible. See? Aurora was the proof of concept that this approach worked against even the most secure targets. The subsequent operations were refinements and expansions of the same methodology. The tools got better. The operators got more experienced. The targeting became more strategic. But the core techniques that succeeded in Aurora continued to succeed across hundreds of subsequent operations. Security researchers analyzing these Chinese APT groups consistently found code fragments, infrastructure patterns, and operational techniques that traced back to Aurora. It wasn't that the same people were conducting all these operations. It was that Aurora had established a playbook that became doctrine for Chinese cyber espionage units. The human cost of Aurora extended beyond stolen source code and corporate security failures. The Gmail accounts that were compromised during the operation belonged to Chinese human rights activists whose identities and communications were exposed to Chinese intelligence services. Some of these activists were later arrested. Whether their arrests were directly caused by intelligence gathered during Aurora or were coincidental is still classified, but security researchers who've studied the operation believe the connection is probable. One activist who was targeted during Aurora spoke anonymously to journalists years later. They described the paranoia that followed learning their Gmail account had been compromised. Every contact in their address book was potentially exposed. Every email they'd sent discussing dissident activities was potentially read by Chinese security services. Every meeting they'd organized could have been monitored. The psychological impact was devastating even before any arrests happened, because they could never know for certain what information had been accessed and what consequences might follow. Some activists stopped using email entirely after Aurora. Others switched to more secure communication methods, though that often meant reducing their ability to coordinate with international supporters and journalists who weren't technically sophisticated enough to use encrypted tools. The chilling effect on dissent is impossible to quantify, but was undoubtedly real. When activists know that using mainstream communication tools like Gmail exposes them to state surveillance, they face impossible choices. They can stop communicating electronically and lose the ability to organize effectively in the digital age. They can continue using those tools and accept the risk that everything they do is potentially monitored. Or they can try to use more secure alternatives and risk making mistakes that expose them anyway. Aurora demonstrated that even the most powerful technology companies couldn't protect their users from determined nation-state adversaries. That revelation had ripple effects throughout communities that depend on digital tools to organize against authoritarian governments. Some human rights organizations tried to move to more secure platforms after Aurora, but the technical barriers were significant, and the alternatives often lacked the functionality that made Gmail useful for coordination and outreach. The fundamental problem was that security and usability are often in tension. The most secure systems are hardest to use, which limits who can adopt them and what kinds of activities they support. Google's decision to relocate their Chinese search operations to Hong Kong in response to Aurora was unprecedented corporate pushback against a major government. The move was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it allowed Google to continue serving Chinese users while operating from a jurisdiction where they wouldn't be required to censor results according to mainland Chinese law. Symbolically, it was a statement that Aurora had crossed a line that made continued cooperation with Chinese censorship requirements untenable. The Chinese government responded by increasingly restricting access to Google services from mainland China. The Great Firewall made it difficult to reach Google's Hong Kong-based search. Gmail access became unreliable. Google's presence in the Chinese market diminished significantly. The economic cost to Google was substantial. They lost access to what would become the world's largest internet market. But the decision established a precedent about how far companies should accommodate government demands that conflict with their values or threaten their security. If you've made it through this deep dive into the cyber operation that changed how we think about internet security and corporate vulnerability to nation-state attacks, thank you. This channel explores real intelligence operations and cyber campaigns that shaped the modern world, not theoretical threats or hypothetical scenarios, but actual operations that penetrated the most secure networks on Earth and forced us to rethink fundamental assumptions about cybersecurity. Operation Aurora was just the beginning. The techniques pioneered in that operation evolved into an entire ecosystem of nation-state cyber espionage that continues today with capabilities that make Aurora look primitive by comparison. If you want more stories about how nation-states conduct cyber warfare, how elite hackers breach billion-dollar companies, and how these operations keep evolving in sophistication and scale, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. The cyber domain is now the primary battlefield for intelligence operations, and every major nation is conducting operations that make headlines when they get exposed, but mostly succeed while remaining hidden. We're covering all of it. The operations, the techniques, the strategic objectives, and the human cost that doesn't make it into the threat intelligence reports. So here's my final question for you. Could Aurora happen today? We have better security now, zero trust architectures, improved threat intelligence sharing, sophisticated detection systems powered by AI and machine learning. Security teams have learned from Aurora's lessons. But attackers also have better tools, more resources and capabilities that didn't exist in 2009. They have AI-powered social engineering. They have more zero-day exploits. They have even more sophisticated infrastructure for hiding their operations. If Chinese intelligence launched Aurora 2.0 tomorrow, using current techniques against current defenses, would Google detect it faster than 3 months? Would any company? Or has the attacker advantage only increased as capabilities have evolved on both sides? Think about the fundamental dynamic. Davis identified Aurora, but the organizational systems failed to act on his warnings. Have those organizational dynamics actually improved? Or do security teams still drown in alerts and struggle to distinguish real threats from noise? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This isn't just about historical curiosity. It's about whether the lessons we learned from Aurora 15 years ago are actually sufficient for the threats we face today. The servers that hosted Aurora's command and control infrastructure are long gone. The data they contained was wiped and the hardware destroyed or sold off years ago. The zero-day exploit that enabled the initial infections was patched by Microsoft in April 2010 and no longer works on any modern system. The specific malware variants Aurora deployed have been analyzed and documented in exhaustive detail by security researchers, and detection signatures exist to identify them. But the fundamental capabilities Aurora demonstrated and the vulnerabilities it exposed remain as relevant today as they were in 2009. Nation-states still target private sector companies for economic espionage and political surveillance. Zero-day exploits still exist in widely used software, and attackers still use them to enable operations. Social engineering still works because humans are still susceptible to well-crafted manipulation. Supply chain compromises are still effective because complex systems create countless opportunities for exploitation. The technical details have changed as both offensive capabilities and defensive measures have evolved, but the strategic dynamics haven't fundamentally shifted. Determined nation-state attackers still have asymmetric advantages against corporate defenders. They have more time, more resources, and only need to succeed once, while defenders need to succeed continuously. They can be patient and methodical, while defenders operate under resource constraints and time pressure. They can exploit the organizational and psychological dynamics that cause real threats to be dismissed as noise until it's too late. The reforms that followed Aurora's exposure, mandatory breach reporting, information sharing initiatives, zero-trust security architectures, expanded government cyber capabilities represented genuine progress. Companies are more prepared for nation-state attacks than they were in 2009. The cybersecurity industry has matured significantly. Threat intelligence has become more sophisticated. But every year, major corporations still get breached by advanced, persistent threat groups. Every year, nation-states conduct cyber espionage operations that succeed in stealing valuable information before being detected. The arms race between attackers and defenders continues to escalate, and it's not clear that defenders are winning. Aurora taught the security community that even elite companies with world-class security could be comprehensively breached. 15 years later, that lesson remains true. The techniques have evolved, the targets have adapted, but the fundamental vulnerability of complex digital systems to determined, sophisticated adversaries hasn't been solved. Maybe it can't be solved. Maybe the best we can achieve is resilience, accepting that breaches will happen and focusing on minimizing their impact, detecting them faster, and responding more effectively. That's a less comforting conclusion than claiming we've fixed the problems Aurora exposed. But it might be a more honest assessment of where cybersecurity actually stands today in an era where nation-states treat the cyber domain as a routine battlefield for intelligence operations and strategic competition.